So the cancer and alcohol link is a well-known thing for many years. From one side, the scientists all understand and talk about it, but the societies, almost in all countries, I think the awareness is really low. Now, Ireland is doing something that no other country in the European Union is even considering, introducing the cancer warning labels on alcohol products. Exactly, the labeling issue as such in the European Union is a hot topic, but at best we are talking about calories and ingredients, but no health warnings. So, Eunan, would you talk a little bit how Ireland even started that discussion? What's the backstory?
Well, the backstory is a long story, but we'll try and keep it very short. Essentially, towards the beginning of this century in Ireland, obviously there was a significant spike in relation to alcohol consumption, whereby, in tandem with an economic surge and economic growth in the country, alcohol consumption became essentially hedonistic and really very heavy, and we spiked at around 14.5 litres per capita. And that period of the first decade of the 21st century was essentially really awash with alcohol until we hit an economic recession. But out of that period, obviously, a lot of aspects around alcohol were debated and discussed. And obviously, the realm of public health became a very big crisis in relation to that, because obviously there was a lot of people who became aware and advocated around the risk around alcohol. And in that respect, the Department of Health in Ireland essentially put together a steering group to examine what would become a national substance misuse strategy. And that debated between 2009, 10 and 11, and ultimately reported in 2012, which is 8 years ago. And central to that, and in tandem with what was the WHO first initial stab at the process of trying to develop a coherent strategy around reducing alcohol consumption and harm, that particular strategy highlighted the need for essentially a better awareness amongst the consumer that what was the risk associated with alcohol. And essentially that brought in the area of, well, what would those health warnings be, and what would be the health information that would be perhaps cited on the alcohol products at the point of purchase. So that particular strategy led ultimately to the development of a legislative framework, essentially, which was published in 2013. It was debated sort of internally within government departments for a couple of years, and eventually published and brought into the Parliament in 2015. And it's a very radical piece of legislation, because it is a first in the context of Ireland, but also perhaps in Europe in some respects, in so much in Ireland. And it dealt with alcohol from a perspective of public health, and it's tried to endeavour to say we are losing 3 people a day because of alcohol-related harms. Our children are drinking too young, etc. All the normal messages that are around the public health considerations for the dangers and the risks of alcohol. And essentially it tried to approach all of the areas: price, promotion, the product, the availability of it, the information around the product, all of these essentially 12, 13 significant interventions into the marketplace, essentially to try and curb the stimulus around alcohol consumption. And a key part of it, or one of the key parts, was that essentially it did address the issue of health information and warning on alcohol products. And essentially what it does is it carries the legislation as it was passed, and it took 3 years to get it passed because of significant opposition by the alcohol industry. The label and warnings essentially highlight the primary legislation says that labels in the future should highlight the risk to pregnancy from alcohol, the risk to your health in general, crucially, as we discussed, the issue around cancer and the fatal link between alcohol, the link between alcohol and fatal cancers, and then subsequently, from an information point of view, what are the calorie content, the kilojoules, what is the gram of alcohol contained in the product that you're purchasing, and a public health website portal, so that you will be able to remove from all products any alcohol industry source of information on alcohol, and replaced it with what is a public health portal designed and developed by the Health Service Executive in Ireland. So they are the key measures that are contained in the Act. And the Act was, as I say, was enacted in 2018. There was a considerable battle in relation to bringing those particular health warnings through a process, because as a member state of the EU, we obviously had to engage in a significant consultation and scrutiny through the Commission. And that journey is still unfinished, because the regulations that will actually make this labelling provision happen have yet to be concluded. So there's still another round and an engagement with the EU Commission in relation to essentially ratifying or certainly approving some degree of the regulations that are proposed. So obviously, from the Irish perspective, the reason that we sought to highlight this particular strand of health warning that said that that the public should be informed of the direct link between alcohol and fatal cancers is largely driven by what we would regard as an outlier situation in Ireland around the link between alcohol and cancers. And in particular, we have a particular scenario whereby the link between alcohol and breast cancer is particularly pronounced in Ireland. So in Europe, top of my head, remembering, I think in Europe, broadly, it's 1 in 10 breast cancers are related to alcohol, whereas in Ireland, it's 1 in 8. And so we have a significant outlier position in respect of that. And that, plus obviously we have very well documented evidence around the level of alcohol related diagnostics around cancer, especially around mouth and mouth, head and neck cancers, colon cancers, and other related gastroenterology type cancers. So essentially, what we did was, in recognition of that, was we essentially tried to bring about a very coherent advocacy alliance around this particular issue. And so, in fact, what occurred was, first and foremost, we established a very coherent alliance amongst the key NGO players in kind of cancer prevention in Ireland to essentially, I suppose, develop a conversation around trying to getting those parties to really significantly understand the risk that was involved. And then, broadly, once there was an agreement around what was a particular strategy, we essentially advocated for the particular measure to be included in the legislation. And that took significant process of engagement, education, seminars, public discourse, media debate, essentially all the usual tools of advocacy. But essentially, in the end, it was included in the bill as it was at the time, by amendment as it happened in our upper house. That's how we got it actually physically into the legislation. And because cancer is such a hot topic issue in relation to most families, especially in Ireland. Anyways, there isn't a family in Ireland who hasn't experienced either a mortality or certainly a brush with mortality in relation to cancer. It became very apparent to our parliamentarians that this was actually quite a reasonable endeavour. And obviously we were supported in that endeavour by our European partners, certainly in the European Public Health Alliance people, Eurocare, a variety of medical professions across Europe as well, who similarly are very keen to try and establish a clarity around what is a proven known risk from alcohol. And indeed, just in that respect, you know, even as recently as yesterday, you know, we continuously are engaging, obviously at a European level, because we now have a situation where the new Commission essentially has a target or an objective around establishing the EU Beating Cancer strategy. So we're very keen to engage that process at every opportunity to ensure that at that strategic level, at the EU Commission level, that there's a real recognition. And we understand as of yesterday that there will be significantly a clear recognition within the strategy when it's published in December of the absolute link between alcohol and fatal cancers. And I think that's a very important step, which would facilitate, obviously, not just the passage of our particular legislative process through the European Commission when it has to go through yet another scrutiny, but also presumably it would be of significant bolstering to the endeavours of other organisations across Europe who are similarly trying to appeal to their governments to act in such a manner.
That's good. Well, you mentioned the opposition, of course. Was it only the alcohol industry, or did it come from anywhere else? And what were the main arguments against such a plan?
Well, the principal actors who were against the measure were the alcohol producers. And typically, I'm sure it's no different in other countries. I mean, they're represented by essentially a confederation or a business organization. And in fact, that organization probably got off on the wrong foot in relation to its particular campaign, in so much as that they actually live on public television actually denied the link between alcohol and cancer. And so they, along with a series of, or a variety of different surrogates and actors that essentially are the heads of many heads of the one monster, if you want to call it that. You know, they essentially they take on a variety of different guises, but essentially it is the alcohol industry who were opposed to it, and nobody else. And so they essentially, the tactics that were used essentially by the industry were first and foremost denial, and after that was, you know, essentially clarified in a very public way, they moved on to the relative risk and sought to essentially diminish the risk by carrying a variety of other types of related commodities or sources of cancer related risk. But of course the relative risk was with alcohol is significantly much greater than some of the particular cases. But it was, I suppose, in the words of David Michaels, you know, it was essentially doubt was their product. You know, they essentially washed the argument with as much doubt as possible, with the endeavour of trying to ensure that the argument was lost. But they were unsuccessful to date in relation to that. And I think it's worth saying that, you know, from our broader advocacy point of view, you know, the establishment of a clear risk to one's health from alcohol-related cancers is a very powerful message, because I think, as I said earlier, you know, there isn't a citizen in any country in the European Union who cannot but relate to the risk of cancer and really understand, you know, quite frankly, the difficulties and the challenges that, you know, exist from trying to recover from cancer or living with cancer. This is a very difficult space. So the idea that alcohol, like tobacco, would be clearly related to its source, I think is a very powerful message. And you know, so I think that it's likely to be a very strong advocate tool for many organizations. Now, I think one of the difficulties that are certainly in our perspective, I think one of the difficulties that the typical NGOs around cancer prevention organizations, one of the difficulties they probably encounter in some ways in trying to carry this message is there's always a conflict with their fundraising type endeavors. And I think that I suspect, I don't know for certain, but I suspect that there's sometimes a debate that goes on internally in these organizations that says, well, we don't really want to push this particular agenda too hard because, you know, on the other side, we'll probably lose some people, because alcohol and the narrative around alcohol, the branding, the brand relationships that populations have with alcohol is so powerful that when you seek to, you know, chip away at the foundations of that relationship in such a profound manner as saying there's a direct link between what you're consuming and cancer, then that becomes a very challenging position. And it really strikes at the heart of that relationship. So it's a complex relationship for perhaps sometimes I suspect the NGO community around cancer prevention.
Sure. So as I understand, almost a decade, the Irish society was discussing that. What do you think? How that discussion affected? How did it affect the overall awareness of that link? Because what we see that in almost all countries, the awareness still is really low.
Yeah, I think that sometimes it baffles sometimes the role that we have to try and understand how we haven't made more progress in respect to actual what is our core objective, which is to ensure that people drink less alcohol. Yeah. And you know, we've made some progress in that respect over the last year or two, but I think sometimes in the public mind there are two separate silos here. There's a debate that happens around health promotion, health prevention, all of that area, and then there's what they see as their normal daily activity, certainly within the Irish context anyhow. You know, where alcohol in Ireland is such an everyday commodity. It is, you know, it's as ubiquitous as milk. It doesn't place anything unusual or anything out of ordinary. It is absolutely central to the course of life for the better part of 80% of the population. So I think that somehow these two things sit very separately. So I think that what has happened, certainly in the last 5 years, in the terms of the debate that we would have led around alcohol and cancer awareness, is that there is definitely a higher awareness of the risk. But whether that has actually led to action to reduce your consumption and take measures accordingly is a separate matter. Because of course, as you know better than most, Lauri, the resources on either side are vastly outweighed, you know. So whilst we might be one voice arguing and advocating for a position for people to take a higher level of awareness of the risk, on this side there's 400 voices every day in people's ears saying your life is going to be so much better if you keep drinking that alcohol. So it's a completely imbalanced discussion, and you know, so it's extremely difficult for that one whisper of health prevention to make its way through the noise and to make an impact on what is a complete tsunami been amplified on the other side.
Right. So as you mentioned, in 2018 the act was adopted, right?
Yes.
But the warnings are not yet on the bottles. So what's your best feeling? what do you see? What are the next steps, and how will it end in Ireland?
Well, I suppose we have a Westminster type style, parliamentary system here. So we pass primary legislation, and then it's usually empowered or commenced or enacted in relation to secondary legislation. So regulation is required in many instances of the measures that are included in the Act. The Act itself was a tremendous victory for us, because obviously it took 8 years or 6 years to really get it onto the statute books, and that in itself was a huge achievement. So far, 4 or 5 measures, let's call it the low-hanging fruit, of measures have been actually commenced and will be implemented. We're in this November period coming ahead now, we're going to see a significant change in relation to the availability of alcohol, because the ubiquity of it through our retail landscape is going to be curtailed and brought back in some respects. So that will be a notable victory in relation to just somehow curbing that what we call that impulsive purchase of alcohol, because in Ireland after November, that impulsive purchase will be an awful lot more difficult. But in terms of the big measures, the issues like minimum unit pricing, which still hasn't been commenced, the issues around a really significant change in how alcohol is advertised and marketing, that hasn't been commenced. The issues around the labelling, as we've been discussing, haven't been commenced. And in that respect, what's required is we first have to publish, the government, the Department of Health will have to publish the regulations, the actual specific regulations. So in other words, the primary legislation outlines the broad concept around what's required. Here are the 6 issues that should be included. But how do you specifically do that? What's the font size? Where should it be? All of those specific details, they must be included in the regulation. We expect that they will probably be published before the end of the year and submitted to the European Union Commission, we suspect. We've had a change of government in recent times, and obviously the COVID crisis has obviously set everybody into somewhat of a convulsed state. So it'll take a little bit of time, but we would hope that by the end of the year, those regulations will be published and submitted to the European Union. At worst case scenario, certainly early next year. It is likely that the industry will throw everything at stopping these regulations. We anticipate that there will be all the resources globally thrown at this to try and prevent this from happening, and including potentially legal challenges and etc. That being the case, and recognizing that that's likely to happen, I think it's likely that there'll be an 18-month to 2-year debate and battle and challenges across the European Union in relation to them. And if we're successful, if Ireland is successful in getting it through the European Commission, as is our right under the existing regulations of the EU, because in the existing regulations, a member state has the right to do a unilateral action in relation to labelling if it feels it needs to protect public health. And obviously, as I outlined earlier, we have an outlier in relation to some of these matters. So if we were successful and we get this through, then the industry has 3 years to transition to these particular labels. So we could be having this conversation in 2025 or 2026. But as you know, more than anybody, this is a long game. It's a long game, and you have to have some degree of tenacity and persistence and resilience. And we're up for having the continued challenge.
Well, the situation is that many countries are not even having the discussion yet. They haven't started it. So let's say that you are hired as an advisor to one of the Baltic countries or one of the Nordic countries. What do you recommend? How to start? How to maybe also avoid some of the mistakes, if you did any? If you see, what did you learn from the experience?
Well, I think the first thing that I would advise is that you have to build a very broad alliance. You have to bring in as many NGOs and as many voices from the medical profession, the healthcare profession, the public health guidance people. An alliance of that nature is significant because the reality is that the alcohol industry have a very powerful and very loud voice. And, an endeavor such as this trying to execute an issue like this on your own or as a single entity, it just simply won't work, because you're just simply going to be drowned by, excuse the analogy, you're going to be drowned by the alcohol on the other side. Mm-hmm. So, the bigger the alliance, the greater the amplification. And in our instances, essentially, we moved to a point where we were one voice in the wilderness to, almost 60 voices, and there were 60 powerful voices. So you need to pick your friends, you need to pick your allies, and you need to build an alliance that is as strong and as powerful as your opponents on the other side. How do we do that? Well, we kept the message pretty simple. The evidence is pretty clear, as you know. You need to bring clarity to that evidence. You need to make it decipherable. You need to make it disseminable. It needs to be clear for people what is the actual challenge there, what is the risk, and bring a unanimity to that voice to say, yes, we agree on this one simple message. So I think that's the key. That's the key point of advocacy. I think the learning point that we would have learned was that essentially, 2 points. One is in the legislative process, make sure that you get it at the beginning, you get it included in the beginning, and secondly, don't try to be too ambitious. There certainly was an endeavor at one point to try and ensure that the labeling was a particular size or particular place, or all of those challenges are sometimes they can be a bit of a rat run in terms of just trying to get your success. And we ended up having to certainly at a crucial point it became part of the argument that was unnecessary, and in that respect I think keep it simple, keep it straight, and I think in that context you'll be much more successful. So they're the key things I would say. It's a really, really simple message. It's about bringing as many people behind that message, and as many popular organizations in that respect, and then making sure that you keep it fairly simple for the parliamentarians and the legislators to try and get that message, and subsequently don't make it too complicated in terms of its implementation.
Lastly, you also mentioned the EU's Beating Cancer plan, right? What do you think? Does that give an additional gear in a way to this whole discussion that we didn't have, the 5 years ago or 10 years ago when you started the whole discussion?
There's no question. I completely agree. I think that the opportunity that the EU Commission's objective around the EU Beating Cancer is a real opportunity. I think that at that kind of strategic level, and we've seen it ourselves in our broader work around alcohol legislation or framework, the absence of a framework at an international level, as you'll be familiar with, is it's always a barrier or a difficulty to trying to bring about an alliance or a unanimity around action. So the idea, or the offering potential that the EU would, at a strategic level, at a policy level, outline, here are some of the key points in relation to battling and beating cancer, and that alcohol was clearly articulated in that, would be a very significant development. So I would urge, we've obviously participated in as much of the public consultations that have been available to us to do so. Obviously our MEPs and all that sort of area, we need to do some work with them. But I think it's a very important show in town, and we should be showing up.